Thank you for coming. My name is Robert Reinhardt from VideoRx. Today's session that I'm presenting is evaluating the effectiveness of your H.264 encoder. This is as close to an encoding shootout that I've done in the last, I don't know how many years. I mean, I'll remember it was probably 4 years ago when one of my clients, who shall remain nameless, hired me because they wanted me to compare their encoding product to other encoding products and write a and publish a white paper on it under their name. They didn't like the results I gave them because I didn't make their encoder look like the best one. And they didn't tell me that's what they wanted, but they wanted my frank opinion of it, and those results weren't published. It was fun they still paid me to do the work, and that's why I still like to always be an individual, or I should say independent consultant like I am and with my company and my team. I'm not up here to push one company's product over another. In fact, I'll just jump to I'll give you the conclusion, which is you can pretty much accomplish the best encoding with ffmpeg and H.264, right? I mean, there is no way to get around the fact that if Sorenson and Telestream and Harmonic or whoever decides to license H.264, well, we all have access to those same parameters in ffmpeg, right? It's the same exact codec. So sure, there's licensing fees affected by it. I mean, they're paying a commercial license to H.264. And the devil's in the details, as Jan's session hints at, with licensing just with H.264 and licensing with HEVC. When it comes down to it, it's really difficult for an organization, even like MPEG-LA, to enforce patents on compression, on decoding and encoding. Decoding, it's a little bit easier. You got people like Adobe and Microsoft distributing a decoder version of a codec. You know it's out there, it's public. But how many people are pushing video out there today? There's millions of content providers out there pushing H.264 video. Are they going to go after millions of people to try and get licensing fees? Probably not. I mean, this is not an old problem, right? MP3 technically has licensing requirements too. How many garage bands are selling their music without paying Fraunhofer a dime for using MP3 as a codec, right? So when it comes down to it, and again, I'll link this back to the H.264 discussion, I have no doubt in my mind that when it comes to my day-to-day encoding tasks, I'm going to use H.264 as an H.264 encoder. It just has any of the cloud encoders are using it under the hood. Main concept is still a viable H.264 encoder. It's a good encoder, but it doesn't have all the options that H.264 has. And it's not like you can't get great quality video with main concept, but if you're going after the best quality video, you're likely going to reach some of the same conclusions that I have and other folks as well. My contact information here, I know there's a lot of tweeting going on, so my Twitter ID is Rob_Reinhardt. My company, VideoRx, is also on Twitter. I've written a couple of articles on adaptive streaming, and it doesn't really touch on encoding so much on transitioning.to. I was asked by Streaming Media Magazine to write an article on off-the-shelf players that will be in this January-February issue of Streaming Media Magazine. As I mentioned in my workshops yesterday, the market for off-the-shelf players like JW Player, Video.js, it's phenomenal what you can do with those players, and that all feeds back into the encoding side of things too. You have a lot of options, and that's like my first slide here, right? There's no definitive way to encode. Obviously, what I'm up here talking about is my observations based on the number of years and hours I've spent encoding with different products. And they can change overnight, right? I mean, the nice thing about all the commercial encoders is that they're fairly responsive. I mean, I just opened up Episode, and there's a point release I need to update to because I haven't updated it. So they're usually on top of bug fixes, and that's something with the open source community. You're not necessarily, you have a lot of people contributing to open source code bases like ffmpeg and even H.264 is not open source, but there are contributors to that, and the source code is there for you to look at. You can compile H.264 on your own, so all the source code is there. There's ways to contribute to that. there's really three factors, I think, and I don't want to say pick two. Everyone loves to come up with like three things and like pick two. You can't have all three, right? Like something that's cheap, has high quality, and has great speed. I mean, speed is largely going to be a factor of your hardware, right? When it comes to video encoding, I don't care if it's live transcoding or encoding for VOD. Your hardware is going to dramatically affect that. There's GPU acceleration that is going to help out with some encoding products. Usually GPU accelerated H.264 encoding means you give up options. You don't necessarily, you might not get B-frames in some GPU acceleration. There's a reason why GPU is faster. It's because it has a very specific algorithm that it's going to use to compress H.264 video. It's usually locked to a certain profile, and it's great for live. I mean, obviously, if you've got an incoming stream of bits and you got to get them out of the door with the lowest latency possible, you've got to make decisions in that hardware for how that H.264 is going to be encoded. Quality, everyone wants high quality video. Who wants their video to look all blocky and crappy? I don't know anyone who intentionally would want to deliver bad looking video. Maybe if they were trying to break into their competitor's vault and put in bad video. We just messed them up. We put in bad video. Switched out their 720p with really crappy looking 360p. The cost factor, I don't want to say it doesn't even, the adage you get what you pay for doesn't even really apply anymore, given that something like ffmpeg as a tool doesn't cost you anything. Now, we all know, I should hope to say we all know the difference between price versus cost, right? The price tag of ffmpeg is 0. But what is the cost of using ffmpeg? You need someone who knows how to use a command line utility, knows how to integrate it with your workflow, and is comfortable with that, right? I'm a geek. I have no problem setting up scripts that are going to automate ffmpeg to fit into a workflow just like a commercial product could fit their automation tools into a workflow. But if you need all sorts, and I don't want to skip ahead, but since I'm talking about cost, I think the primary differences you'll see in commercial codecs in a tool like ffmpeg is ingest, right? ffmpeg is not likely going to support all the crazy number of broadcast formats that are in use today. So if you're a big broadcaster, going to a Harmonic product makes a lot of sense because you're going to be able to ingest a ton of different formats that ffmpeg may not support. Now, if you're working with content providers that have no problem giving you specific types of source files, like, hey, yeah, I have 720 ProRes QuickTime MOVs, that's perfect for ffmpeg. If you're in control of your pipeline and all the content that goes into it, like lynda.com is a great example of a client of mine where they control that entire process. It's not like they're being handed source files and they have to transcode it to another one. They shoot the video, they produce it, they do everything. So, if they want to use a specific coder that can only take a limited number of formats, they're not limited by those limited number of formats. They can easily get a source format created that's going to let that encoder work, in the case that I'm talking about, ffmpeg. This isn't an encoding class in the sense that I'm going to go through, like, this is how we encode video, but, these are obviously, this is the base minimum that we need for a good encoder to work effectively. These are all the things I need to be able to control. Any encoder that can't expose these is already just sort of dead on arrival, right? I need to be able to control, and I would say, even within the last 3 years, there were some tools that wouldn't even let you select a profile for it. Adobe Media Encoder is one that comes to mind. In some of the early, H.264 was plenty popular, and you couldn't control whether it was baseline or main. You just sort of had to take whatever H.264 flavor it decided to spit out. Same things with audio codec. If you don't know what kind of AAC codec is being used, is it low complexity? Is it high efficiency? If it's not labeled, it's probably low complexity. But again, being able to have the options exposed or available if it's in a command line tool like ffmpeg is pretty critical. Bit rates for audio and video and audio channels and sampling rate, that's all straightforward stuff. The keys to a high performant H.264 codec, or rather encoder, if it's on commercial grade, and even with a tool like ffmpeg, you'll at least have options, right? Because, like I mentioned before, main concept in X264 have commercial licensing fees associated with it. If you're using it if you're making money from your encoding, and that doesn't include ad support, by the way. That was on the decoding side of things. So if you're a content delivery agent and you're supplying ad-supported video, on the decode, you don't necessarily have to pay a royalty. But if you're building your own custom encoder and you're using H.264 and you're not paying a Telestream or a Rosette, well, you likely would owe them still royalties for encoding. But again, the devil's in the details. How are they going to find you? They're probably not, unless you're on the radar. I mean, if you're at ABC and you start pushing out unlicensed video codecs, then you're a big company. You've got a lot of money. You're going to be a sought-after target. If you're someone who's making yoga videos and you've got a subscriber base of a couple thousand people, probably not going to be on the radar. Who knows how they might clamp down in the future. But B-frame controls, being able to specify how many B-frames. B-frames are bi-predictive frames. It's actually one of the things that makes H.264 a great codec, is the ability for a non-keyframe to look ahead or behind. It's also called frame reordering, being able, that's also why H.264 in main and high profile tends to require more CPU. And again, some of the details on HEVC are still not known by a guy like me because we don't have encoding tools to support it yet. But B-frame is one of those things that really adds to CPU overhead if it's being rendered by CPU or being assisted by GPU. I mean, come on, think about it. If you have a GOP of 30 frames and you have 2 B-frames in that GOP, and that's just in one, GOP. It could be a 10-second GOP, 6-second GOP, whatever your keyframe interval is. In order for a processor to rearrange frames on the fly so that they play back in the right sequence, that's a lot of heavy lifting. You're reordering frames. But it has great compression efficiency. So that's again, what keeps H.264 on the map in terms of a great codec. Profile control. And I would say enhanced B-frame controls too, not just being able to specify the count, but are you using pyramid B-frames, which are sort of adaptive B-frames, like, well, maybe one GOP only needs 1 B-frame or no B-frames, another GOP needs 2 or 3. You can have up to 16 B-frames according to the spec. Most video doesn't benefit from more than 3 or 4 B-frames per GOP, but again, those kind of controls are important. A tool like Adobe Media Encoder doesn't expose B-frame controls at all. Any of the professional tools from Telestream or Rosette, or Harmonic rather, and Sorenson, you're going to have B-frame controls in those products. Profile control, baseline main versus high, if those aren't terms that you're familiar with, it really sets the bar for what processing power is required for that video to play back, right? Older iPhones, for example, iPhone 3G and 3GS could only play H.264 baseline. They couldn't play main or high. So if you're encoding everything in main profile, or if you don't know what your encoder's encoding in, it's probably either going to pick baseline or main if it's not exposing it. I would be really surprised to see an encoder choose high profile because it's very CPU intensive compared to the other two, or I should say it's more CPU intensive. Then you're going to have video that doesn't play on that device. Yesterday in one of my workshops, I mentioned the fact that if you don't want to approach any of the complicated stuff that adaptive streaming and HLS, all those kind of fun streaming mechanisms enable us to do with adaptive bit rates, I would, at this juncture in time, still recommend 1 baseline and 1 main, or 1 baseline. Maybe you want to hedge your bets towards high profile, but that lets you at least not cater to the lowest common denominator with 1 profile. If I encode everything in baseline, baseline sort of removes all the goodness from H.264. There's no B-frame support. There's no CABAC compression. CABAC is just a way to actually compress the binary data in that stream. It's sort of like, think of it like zipping a file. There's different ways to do that zip compression. And CABAC is one of those things that main and high can do, baseline can't do it, and it's intentionally restricted so that if you have a cheap phone, it's still going to play. We all know that device manufacturers don't like to put a lot of money into the hardware. They'll get away with a unless it's a value add, like they're making it a premium product. If it's just your average consumer phone that someone who's not a techie is going to appreciate the super duper power that's in there, chances are it's got a weak processor and you're not going to be able to throw crazy video at it. Every iPhone today now, iPhone 5 and iPhone 5S can play everything up to high profile. So it can, it's got a super fancy processor compared to, say my T-Mobile G2 that's like 2 years old that I still use for testing purposes. Read ahead or look ahead is another factor I look for in encoders. So that's basically how many frames, that greatly can affect either one pass or two pass encoding. It's just how far it's looking ahead into the stream to determine that buffer when it's creating its GOP. So the more frames you read ahead before an encoder determines how it's going to compress a given sequence, the more likely you're going to have a quality stream. This is, again, in something like a live stream, you have a very limited, you virtually have no read ahead. I mean, you have to fill a buffer, but it's going to be a very, very limited read ahead. In VOD compression, you can a good encoder, and I'll show you what I mean by this, just to give you an example. Like, what do you mean read ahead? Show me a concrete example of a read ahead. I'll go here into episode and just show you that if I choose the video codec and go into profile and quality, let me just see if I can detach this. Well, it won't, but you know what? I can do that fancy fun stuff where I'm going to zoom in. So number of frames to look ahead. So you can determine, and there's a hard limit of 250 with this specific H.264 profile that I've selected. Your options are going to change too depending on what codec you choose, whether it's the X.264 versus the main concept, because it will you usually have both options. If a company is shipping X.264, they're still enabling their old H.264 option, whatever it may have been, main concept, or I can't even remember the other provider now. But anyway, that's what I mean by number of frames to look ahead. It's usually, again, drilled down, and it's just the higher that value is set, the longer it's going to take to compress, because it's analyzing all those frames that are coming down the pipe, and it's giving your encoder a lot more space to determine what it's going to borrow from in terms of keyframes. If you're doing things like adaptive streaming, I tend to not set number of frames on the look ahead to be greater than the GOP size. So if my GOP is 300 frames, and I can't even go up to 300 with this, you don't want to look more than your GOP size, because your GOPs for adaptive streaming like HLS typically need to be self-contained. You've got a keyframe at the beginning, and any frame that comes after that keyframe needs to reference itself. You can get complicated in H.264 compression where your predictive frames and B frames can look between different GOPs for borrowing information, but again, that would be a bit more of a complicated scenario and is adding way more to the strain of the decoding process as well. So you can see that the default here is set to 40 frames, which is essentially once, if it's 30 frames per second video, that's barely a second ahead. I would say if you want to maximize the effectiveness, set this to exactly the same size as your GOP and go from there, which again is just going to be your keyframe interval. Let me go ahead and zoom out and go back to my deck here. Got to always be mindful of time. Read ahead. Reference frame count. This is an interesting one. Sorenson Squeeze doesn't even, they might have fixed this in a recent update, but this, the reference frame is just the span, how many frames another frame can reference. Again, this value, according to the H.264 spec, can be as high as 16. We like these, powers of 2 kind of factor in math. So reference frames, and this was problematic. I found in some of my X.264 testing of Squeeze that since it didn't have a reference frame count controller for X.264, it was using the maximum, 16, which won't play on an iPad 2. You could try it out yourself. Like you want to typically have, and this will actually, your reference frame count, the general literature, if you research the web, will say, typically a reference frame count higher than 8 is not going to yield any beneficial results and just slow down your encoding with minimal gains to your final encoded stream. and the type of footage that typically benefits from higher reference count is high motion content. The more you can borrow from other frames when there's a lot of movement in the frame, higher reference frames are going to help out in that scenario. I remember seeing that starkly on some Nike footage that I worked on a while ago for a Nike SB documentary. What was that debacle? Where we going to a much higher reference frame count retained some detail in this crazy titling sequence that actually had more motion than the skaters themselves. So the reference frame count can come in handy in those kind of high motion scenarios. But again, being able to control these things is a good thing. And again, the more we get into these technical terms, like now we're looking at the video bitrate verifier, the buffer size. This is critical to the rate control on a codec like an H.264 codec like H.264. Main concept has similar connotations too, but again, that's such a thing that most people will mess up, that if you want to change that size on most commercial encoders, it's going to be buried. The VBB, the VBV, the video bitrate verifier. And this is really also is what typically controls really how variable your bit rate's going to be. You've probably heard terms like constant bit rate, CBR, versus VBR, variable bit rate. And the size of your VBV buffer, it's a hard thing to say sometimes, is going to determine really that variance. The larger your buffer, and this is the decoding buffer that fills up on your set-top box or on your whatever your player is going to really determine. If you have a very short buffer size, that means there's not as much variant in the bit rate, which is great for constant bit rate, but it's also going to dramatically affect quality if you dial that in too low. I usually, like, the rule of thumb is to usually make it at least 1 second's worth of video. So you can sort of, if your bit rate is 500 kilobits per second, then having a buffer size of 500K might be a good start as a VBV buffer size. But even that can send HLS verification. And what I mean by verification, when you test HLS streams without Apple tools to see how well they adhere to a bit rate, the lower you go with VBV, the better. I was going to just show you that again in episode when we're talking about VBV. You can see it's. I'll zoom into it again. It's actually not even hidden. It's shown down here as well, right in the main page. So you can see your average bit rate and the VBV size. And it's not listed in a per seconds. It's a fixed size. So it's 500 kilobits. That's how big it is. And you can see that there's even a max bit rate on how fast that 500 kilobits can fill. So it gets a little, there's devils in these details. Usually, again, you don't want that fill rate to be much faster than the actual size itself. I find that the max bit rate is not as critical as you want those to work hand in hand. You typically, with H.264, can't specify one without specifying the other. So you can actually see that my bit rate might actually vary anywhere between 500 and 770 kilobits per second. Even if you set all things equal in a command line utility like ffmpeg, your results may vary. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to always get a constant 500 kilobit per second stream if you match all those variables up. With any testing, if you're trying to set up presets that you're going to reuse from one to the next, I would recommend making sure that you test it against a variety of footage. Oh, it looked it up on Wikipedia. How about that? I hovered over it too long. Let me go back to the slide. I don't want to lose. I want to get to some of the comparisons that I built. I'll run out of time. Finally, entropy type. I already mentioned it in passing. Cabac versus Kavlik. That's how I pronounce it as grown up in the Midwest. But CAB AC compression versus CAV LC compression. That's also something that a tool like Adobe Media Encoder isn't going to expose. It's just it's an intentional decision just so that people don't mess things up. If I go back into episode, since it's the one I have handy, again under. It's likely going to be under advanced. Where did I put the? it's different when they, depending on which, if I'm using the default one. Oh, there it is. Entropy is auto from preset. So I'm going to, it's automatic. So notice that when I have, again, this is where having a good, what you're paying for with a commercial encoder is a GUI that hopefully knows that setting one option is not going to be beneficial for another option. In this case, the profile is set to baseline. I'll zoom in on that. And baseline, of course, can't use anything other than Kavlik, so it's going to gray it out. Kavlik is the least of the intense of the two methods that we have. If I choose main or high, now I can start to choose Kavlik or CABAC. CABAC is going to be the higher quality of these two. You could even run tests yourself where you do a Kavlik versus a Kavlik and leave everything else the same. And chances are, unless it's just a still head that really doesn't need a whole lot of compression to begin with, if it's got anything like shadow details, movement, you'll notice a difference with CABAC versus Kavlik in that scenario. It's generally just, if you're using main, I almost always turn it on. Like if you're already making a decision to use up more CPU by having a main profile, then use these other options like B-frames, CABAC. If you're using baseline, you don't even have those options. So you can't use them. Let's go back again here. I don't want to be too crazy frantic. I've got a whole 20 minutes or so till I lose you. I already mentioned keeping your reference frames limited to less than 16. 14 is typically the max I'll go to make sure that, I'll just be honest with you, iPad 2 tends to be my litmus test for any main profile that I'm doing that's, and frame size. I don't typically send a 720p to an iPad 2. Quarter res H10 540p is typically good enough for an iPad resolution at 1024 by 768. iPad 1 and 2 resolution. iPad 3 and iPad Air have much higher resolutions than that, so you can start to push 720p at the newer iPads. But again, if you're just blanket, I like iPad 2 as basically, it's like a really cheap laptop too, right? iPad 2's got a lot of power, so if it works on iPad, I sort of use that as my base for moving forward with high quality video. Anything that won't play on an iPad 2 is going to fall into that baseline territory. Older Android devices, older smartphones, and even older tablets. Most tablets on the market can compress or decompress main just because they've got better processors in general, even if they're a cheap tablet. Reference frames, this is also where if you're using baseline, I tend to restrict it to 1 to 3. If you want it to be really backwards compatible with old iPods, iPods, right? Not iPhones, iPods, and you're playing H.264 video on iPods, those early iPods can't even decode more than one reference frame with baseline profiles. So again, if you're already catering to the lowest common denominator, you're not going to notice too much. Baseline's already going to be pretty crappy for bang for byte. If you 1 versus 3 probably isn't going to make a huge difference in quality, so you might as well just go to 1, and that way it's going to play pretty much on the crappiest BlackBerry device and probably just about every Android device. I'll also just say, you'll probably always find some device out there that won't play your video, right? Even if you adhere to all the specs, there's just so many weird BlackBerry devices that if you don't use an exact width and height and frame rate, then forget about it. It won't play an H.264 file. A fixed GOP is good to keep in mind if you plan to ever go to adaptive streaming. If you're not controlling your keyframe interval with a fixed value, and again, this does degrade quality. If you're like Louis C.K. and you're producing your own show and you're selling video for $5 a pop, and you're just selling a download, fixed GOPs don't really apply. You can have a variable GOP, a dynamic GOP, I should say. You can have a really long GOP on VOD that you're downloading and allowing anyone to play on any device. If you're trying to chunk a file, though, for adaptive streaming, it's critical to have a fixed GOP, and that just means there's always a keyframe. Whether it needs it or not, it's always going to inject a keyframe. Some encoders call those natural versus fixed keyframes. A natural keyframe is one that the encoder just says, yeah, there's enough change in scene, I'm going to make a keyframe here. So, and that's why you can also have variable GOPs or dynamic GOPs if you leave it up to the encoder. So again, I'll just show in episode, I should switch to another tool like Sorenson just to show some of these, but they're all there in the commercial tools, these basic settings that I'm talking about, except Media Encoder from Adobe is going to be the one that has the most limitations, period. You're going to get pretty much the same options exposed. How well they utilize those options, though, is another question. And again, I don't want to lose track of time here. I was looking up the, GOP, of course, keyframe control. So you could see here, I was hovering right on it, that I can tell it to have a forced keyframe interval only. And again, that's a fixed GOP. Like only make a keyframe every whatever frame I put in here. You can see it's set to 240 frames, which is going to be a factor of your frame rate. So if I have 2398 and it has to be an integer, you can't use fractional values for keyframe interval. It's going to be a factor of that. So if I know I'm going to use Akamai and I'm going to use a 10-second chunking setup with HLS on Akamai, and I'm using 30 frames a second, 10 times 30 is 300. I would set this to 300. The one thing one of my misgivings with commercial products like this is that it's frame-based. I would prefer that this keyframe interval was time-based, because that way I could reuse that preset then with 24 frame per second footage. I could use it with 30 frame per second footage, and I always know it's going to, because the CDNs and WOWs and Media Server, any of the servers that I configure for a living for my clients, it's all time-based. It's not frame-based when you set up those configs. So there's a mismatch. There's not a parity there with what you see in an encoder versus what you see in the lexicon for streaming that very same footage. I think I'm on to the next slide here. Go Pat. Fixed GOP. So chart of features, I actually have Google Doc URLs to the documents I'm about to show you. I'll tweet them. I'll put them up online for you after the session. But basically, the features that I compared, and hopefully my internet's working here. I got a failure. I was having bad, here it is. So here I have a spreadsheet that's open to the public in terms of viewing, and I put out this. I put together this spreadsheet for VOD features. I'm not going to go through each of these, but you could just right now each column. But I went through and just sort of did the research on what options are supported in one encoder versus the next, going from everything from Media Encoder CS6 and unfortunately Creative Cloud hasn't really changed the options at all for H.264. With Media Encoder. I just verified that over the weekend as I was going through this deck again. And ffmpeg, of course, using libx264 and one of the AAC libraries to compile with it. Okay, so there's this chart. This is more for your research if you want to review this afterwards. It's got a few columns in there. And more importantly, this is what I wanted to get to before I end, is I took a clip from Getty Images that has some varied stuff going on. And I just ran it through a bunch of presets. And I tried to do apples for apples as best I could from one to the next. And it wasn't always clear that ffmpeg was going to be the clear winner in all these tests. It definitely came out on top on most of them. But for some of the presets that I ran through, and these are numbered in the chart, these files I'll make available too. They're not very big MP4 files. They're short clips. But if I'll show you what my general tests of putting these encoders through was. And let's get over there to do that. So the first 4 tests I did were to compare essentially different variations of baseline, right? If I was going to use baseline VBR with a quality-based, what I call dynamic GOP, that's that Louis C.K. scenario. I mean, when Louis C.K., someone like Louis C.K. who's selling video online, I think it was just one video. He didn't offer you different videos to download, and it was probably a main profile clip. I didn't actually look. I bought that clip. I don't have the analysis of it. But again, if you're downloading video or as a video file, or you're playing it as a progressive download or HTTP range request in HTML5, again, no special delivery being used to packetize it, then using variable bit rate and a dynamic GOP is going to be something that you can work with. I also tried using quality-based is a specific H.264 option using the CRF, the constant rate formula, which is why lots of people like H.264. I'll just bring that up right now in terms of if you're not familiar with H.264 as a codec, one of its primary differences from all the other H.264 compression codecs is that CRF factor. And let me just show you that again over here. Notice that up here, and I'll zoom in again so it's visible. But in this version of Squeeze, of Episode, since it has the extra license, it's usually an additional fee to have H.264. I can choose between main concept and H.264. If I choose H.264, which is what's currently selected, and notice there, the very first option, because this is the big decision you have to make. Are we going to, the encoder's asking me, hey, are we talking about an average bit rate where you want to give me lots of numbers and you hope that you know what's going on with your video? Or do we just want to have one conversation about quality? So it's not just one conversation, but this is what's called the CRF mode. They call it constant quality as a short term. And the default is 21 to 23, and it's a relative scale. The higher the number, the worse the quality will be. The lower the number, the more fidelity you're going to have with your original file. And it gets really big pretty quickly. Like if you start to get into even 10 to 15, your file sizes are going to be dramatically different than an 18 to 23. So 21 is the default because that's what typically gives you an average what most people would consider a faithful representation of the video. You may decide that your premium product should really use a quality of 18. And what's nice about this is, again, it's like based on perceptual quality factors of the video. I don't care if it's a sports clip or a talking head clip. I can throw the same clip at a preset or a configuration that I've made in H.264 and be reasonably certain that they're going to look fairly identical. I'm not going to get one that looks incredibly blocky at 21 and another one that doesn't, that looks great at 21. The whole point of this is that we have a perceptual appreciation for that image, and it's coming out consistently. The bad thing about this is that for the most part, it's VBR, but and you'll notice that all the command line switches are grayed out for me. You can still, under the hood with ffmpeg and H.264, still put in some bitrate constraints. You can still control factors of the VBV with, so in other words, what I'm trying to say is that commercial software doesn't typically let you do this, whereas a command line implementation like ffmpeg would. I use CRF with HLS and have great results. It's variable, but you can still set caps so that it doesn't go too far off the mark, so that when you're creating manifests in a programmatic fashion, you will have a reasonable value that it won't exceed. My case in point is that you wouldn't want to set CRF to a value, and again, a sports clip might come out with 2 megabits for some clip, and a talking head clip with the exact same parameters at 21 is going to come out with 500 kilobits. Well, that's obviously, and that's by design, because we only want as many bits as we need. When it comes to making manifests and data representations of that video and its bit rate in your system, you're going to want to do some analysis on the file after it comes out of the encoding, because there's no fixed bit rate, and that's by design, and it's a good thing, right? That way, I'm not just using an arbitrary preset on all my video. Like, why would I want to encode a talking head clip at 2.5 megabits for 720p if I only need 1.5 for it? I'm wasting, I would honestly say that when people are talking about the bit rate budget savings they're going to get with HEVC or H.265, it's probably because they haven't properly done bit budgets on their current content, right? If you just, and I'm not saying, obviously, if we have the same paradigms moving forward with H.265, then technically those same kind of savings can be realized with that codec. Like I said, I have no doubt that they've come out with a better codec. However, I would say that most people, when they deliver video today, use static values for all their content. If they have a library, they're not thinking of it in a way where they're trying to maximize the gains. Because it's not just saving you money, it's saving your consumer, the person who's buying your video or subscribing to it money, right? Because they're not having to spend as much to download it. They're not waiting as long for the video. Why should I wait that long for a talking head clip if it's over bit rated, for example? It's like over JPEGing a file, right? I mean, you can set JPEG qualities in Photoshop at as high as you want, but unless you've got some crazy brilliant sky with like so many shades of blue, you could probably get away with JPEG medium and no one would be the wiser. Perceptually, you're not wasting anyone's file size or budget for downloading it. All right, let's go back. I think that was enough of a tangent on that. So, but again, that just goes in line with again, dynamic GOP, going back to HLS. It wouldn't work with a streaming scenario like that. And then I show fixed GOPs with both CBR and VBR. I'm not going to have time to go through every preset that I did. I want it to be thorough, so I had up to 8. So I did the same thing with main profile. I didn't bother to go to high profile. For most web deployment, high profile doesn't fit into the equation, but more and more we're seeing devices that are capable of decoding high profile. iPhone 5 and 5S can decode high profile. Even iPhone 4, I think, was the first iPhone that could play high profile officially on the books. So these are the various tests. I did the exact same thing that I did with baseline against main. And if there's any one thing I will show you, it's like, well, how can you compare video? If you're pretty sure that you're doing apples for apples comparisons between ffmpeg and another encoder that you prefer to use, you need some way of comparing it. I'm a geek, so hopefully, I already downloaded it. I don't know if my web connection is working to this URL. Oh, it is. Good. Internet's back up on that. If you go to, I have a free tools section on the encoding portal for VideoRX. I have this little video comparison tool that I built. You can download it. It uses Adobe Air, so it's Flash. So, but it runs on the desktop, and I'm going to use that right now. So just quick aside to that. So I already have this installed. It's just a video comparison tool. And what I can do is just drag 2 different videos here and drag a mask between them and play them, right? A really simple tool. I built it for myself. I threw it out there for other people to use. And let me go ahead and pull up the files that I made for this comparison. So the clip, and I should probably show the source file. This is the source file. It's a 1080p. I think this is 1080p. Let me just double check. Oh, it's oh wait, no, where's the original size? Oh no, yeah, it is 1080p. This is from Getty Images. And it's just it has a soundtrack too. My audio's muted. It's not really, oh, come on. It just threw it out because there was an error update. Of course, always an update as soon as you launch a program. So this is the clip. This is the original 1080p footage. It looks great. There's no artifacting anywhere, maybe a little bit back in the sky, but that was probably during acquisition. Who knows? Like, this is as faithful probably to the source that shot this footage. You can see it's a slow pan right now. There was some water moving in the, water moving is always a great thing because, anytime you have water moving, there's just so much change from one frame to the next that encoders are usually going to be tripped up by that. This is a really slow pan that is then going to switch to, and I'll just jump to it because I'm getting bored already. This tracking along this crazy tall mountain, whatever, I use this clip for tests for older Sorenson Spark versus VP6 comparisons. I really liked it just because it did tend to show, like, if I saw artifacting in the snow and all this other stuff with one encoder versus not another one, that would be, it would have telltale signs that the encoder may not be holding up as well as it should. So for the most part, and I guess the good news is that with apples to apples comparisons, and I'll just jump to the chase or cut to the chase, jump to the chase. Geez Louise, I always get these expressions wrong. You'd think I was like not born in America, but the encoders are becoming more and more alike. Back in the day, like a whole 4 years ago, I would be running tests on encode. Well, this stuff changes so fast. I got more gray hair, I think, because of technology than anything else, more so than my 6-year-old. But the the encoders are more and more similar. It's getting harder and harder to see differences between encoders. The only difference really is price at this point. Like, are you going to use a free encoder, or are you going to buy and invest for your organization something that just works better with your workflow? But so I have Adobe Media Encoder. Those are the AME files. And again, it's probably easier just for me to put these online for you to compare to the settings that I was using. But just to, I'll drag, now baseline is great because baseline's a crappier version of H.264, right? I can't do as much fun stuff with it. So I'm just going to drag that very first baseline encode over into the left panel, and I'm going to show you Episode's version of it, Episode Pro, next to it. So I can go ahead and hit play. It's now going to simultaneously play one next to the other. And the other thing that you can see in a tool like this, and if I can I bring down the house? Oh, I can't in this room. I don't think, can I bring down the house lights just a tad? Is that possible? Or is that too crazy a request? But some of the subtleties with just color saturation, I mean, again, the biggest difference with commercial software and something like ffmpeg, or even among commercial software vendors, is likely in the decoding of your source and how color spaces are going to be converted. If you're going from YUV to RGB and back and forth because of filters or pre-processing filters, that's likely going to have an effect on it. So again, I have this mask here. In the beginning, the saturation looked more desaturated coming out of Adobe Media Encoder than it did coming out of Episode Pro, and I didn't have any filter added on Episode Pro. So, but was it pronounced enough that I would care as much about it? Maybe not. But again, like, that's not such a bad thing. Now, again, it's a little bit easier on my laptop, which is why it's probably more fun to run these tests with my little tool than trying to watch it here on this projection. But for the most part, this encode looks pretty good. I haven't seen too many, there's no crazy artifacting going on. But what's going to be the biggest difference in this file versus a main profile is that I'm going to be using way more bits to get the same quality with baseline than I would with main. In a sense, or in short, the file size is going to be bigger for the baseline version to look as good as the main profile version. I'm going to just jump to show, again, I'm not going to have time to go through all of these, but I would like to just show this fifth preset. I went through and bolded the winners that I thought each category had. So I'll jump to preset 5, which is a main profile. Where the actual bit rate, I mean, that's a huge difference in just even bit rate that came out of the equation. 390 kilobits for the clip I'm about to show you versus a pretty high margin on the other ones. Adobe Media Encoder, which isn't using H.264, using main concept, was 904. ProMedia Carbon in this license case is using main concept versus H.264. So again, main concept doesn't have all the same options that H.264 does by design. It's a different codec manufacturer. So it's hard to have apples for apples comparisons. I did my best to equate bit rate settings to those that would match up in main concept as well. Obviously, a quality mode like CRF doesn't even exist in main concept, so it would be, other encoders might attempt to put in a quality base, but it's really just jacking up the bit rate as much as it can so that you got a high quality preset coming out of it. So I'll jump down to preset 5 here, and here's the episode one. It's 8 megabytes. Actually, let's go with the AME because this is just to show you how stark a difference you can get. This is 8.9 megabytes coming out of, sorry, that's not even the right preset. This one, here we go, 12.7 megabytes for preset 5, which is a main profile test. And let me go ahead and reinitialize the comparison tool with that. Oh, it's down. Did I shrink it? And I didn't even know I shrunk it. Where's my comparison tool? Oh, there it is. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and drag Adobe Media Encoder that fifth preset, which is a main concept, at 12.7 megabytes, and compare that to an ffmpeg at the same preset number 5. 5.5 megabytes. So that's quite a stark difference, right? And again, this is just because we're trying to get apples for apples comparisons here, but it's amazing just, again, and I could throttle down Adobe Media Encoder to try and match the bit rate that was coming out of it. But again, part of the benefit of using an H.264 is that you don't have to guess the bit rate. You'll find out the bit rate after it gets encoded. You can have a quality-based approach to it. But you're not likely going, if I start dragging this slider over the different parts, even on in front of me, I'm not seeing any difference in detail loss. Let's just go ahead and jump ahead to another point here. The time sync is off a little bit. It doesn't always seek the same way in this little flash air rendering. But if I'm looking at the one that's more than half the size, it's half the size of the other one. Create it with main profile. It's just it's virtually no difference between those details. If I zoomed in and figured out what was going on, you might see some subtle pixelation differences, but to the naked eye and watching it at native resolution, it wasn't showing anything. So, and then now in the last few minutes I have, I'm just going to summarize the observations after doing all those tests against all the encoders with apples for apples comparisons as best as I could. The baseline encodes were fairly comparable. The main profile ones were not. ffmpeg rivaled most of the others. That's why, starting with preset 5, you'll see that ffmpeg was coming out on top. More importantly, because I could control specific B frames. I mean, I'll make public afterwards I'll put it in a separate document in that Google Doc. But the ffmpeg switches I'm able to use, I can get pretty complicated with B-frame options with ffmpeg compared to commercial products. So it's likely that I'm going to get better bang for byte because I've got more enhanced B-frame options in a H.264 command line driven interface way of approaching encoding. I'm a big, I didn't touch on this yet in the Google Doc, and it's probably a little too complicated to really thoroughly explain right now, but because so much of what I do is adaptive streaming with HLS and even RTMP streaming still with Wowza Media Server, how close, one of the tenets of using a server like Adobe Media Server or Wowza Media Server when it comes to transmuxing formats on the fly for VOD is that we can take one H.264 file and serve it in any flavor of adaptive streaming that's necessary. It has to be able to chunk up the file to do that, and it needs to know what the bit rate is. So what I commonly do, there's a command line tool. I showed it in my workshop yesterday, but you can, after you've created an H.264 file in an encoder, I can throw it on the Wowza Media Server, start streaming it, run it against a stream validator like Apple's Media Stream Validator command line tool, and it will give me stats. In fact, that's how I computed the values here. So if you look at this document, I want you to know how to read it. So, if I took this file, this preset number 3, because remember presets 1 and 2 and 5 and 6 don't use fixed cops, so they're not going to be applicable for adaptive streaming. Well, the bit rate coming out of the encoder, the actual bit rate, that's if you do the math. You can figure out any file's average bit rate by just figuring out how many bits it has. You do the math on how many megabytes, convert that to kilobytes, to bytes, to bits, divide by the number of seconds, and you have bits per second, and then you can go back to kilobits per second, whatever. That's how you can get the actual bit rate of a file as an average. So basically, you can see that I took whatever came out of the preset. It's in that first column, the actual bit rate. The HLS average, though, if I ran it against the validation tool, showed that the average bit rate was 935 kilobits. The maximum bit rate that came out of that file was 1,010 kilobytes. I'm just going from left to right here. And how much is that above the average? That's actually pretty good for an HLS stream. It's only 2%. The average is only 2% above what the bit rate is of the file as it's reported statistically as you calculate it. and it was only the maximum was only 10.5%. Apple is okay if you're trying to get apps approved that consume HLS with, generally speaking, anything that's up to 10% in variance of bit rate. So they're okay with if any time during an HLS stream it exceeds it by 10%. They might start to get worried if any of your sample streams, when you're getting an app qualified or getting it through the App Store, starts to show. I mean, I have looked at some crazy HLS files. Like a client will come to me, broadcasters, whatever, they're like, hey, this HLS isn't switching like we thought it would. And I'll run it through a media stream validator, and there'll be streams that are 100 to 200% more in bit rate than is advertised in the manifest. That's insane, right? I mean, how can a player, whether it's how can an HTML5 HLS decoder intelligently make switching decisions if it's being told that the bit rate is something that it really isn't? It's just going to mess up. So that's why I always like to run any HLS stream that I'm producing on my own system at VideoRX or analyzing someone else's system. I use the media stream validator as a good starting point for that. It's just a command line tool, and it's really easy. I showed this in my workshop, and if you're into adaptive streaming and you don't know about Apple's tools, it's as easy as just taking a URL. I'll even just grab one from one of my workshops yesterday, an HLS URL. I have one here that I have in a JW player. I'm just going to go ahead and take this. Here's an M3U8 file that's on one of my Wowza boxes. I'm going to just say Media Stream Validator. It's right there. And if you've installed the HLS tools that Apple has available on the developer site, you just type, oh, I misspelt it, sorry. Media Stream Validator. If you're a bad typer, you're probably not going to like ffmpeg. And now it's just going to go out and it consumes the manifest. It's going through every single bit rate. It doesn't run it in real time. It just tries to download all the chunks, or it doesn't try it, downloads all the chunks in every manifest, and then it's going to report back to me, oh, how did they actually perform? Are they as advertised? Is it the 800 kilobit stream actually 800 kilobits, or is it more, or is it less? This tool will tell you that, and you can just walk away while it's doing it. It takes a few minutes, but that's how easy it is to validate an HLS stream. There's a couple of tools out there for validating HLS streams, but if you pay the $99 a year for access to Apple's developer portal for Mac OS, you can instantly download this, install it on your Mac. It is a Mac-only command line tool, so yeah, you have to make a $3,000 investment in a MacBook Pro. But other than that, it's just $100 a year. They're more like Microsoft that way than most people realize. Oh, well, it's free, but you have to buy a hardware, right? It's not a problem for most people who love Apple products. But you can see that any of the fixed SCOP presets, I ran through and showed how far they strayed from the average, what the maximum bit rate was, and what that was as a percentage of bit rate. So I did that on any of the fixed SCOP presets that I tried out. And again, lower is better. The lower the variance, the more faithful our stream has been to the original stream bit rate that we thought we were using. I joked yesterday in my workshop that I think encoders, even ffmpeg, I guess the best analogy I came up with, they're a lot like children. Just because you tell them to do something doesn't mean they're going to do it. It's more a suggestion. It's like, hey, I would like you to encode with this bit rate and with this, and this, that, and the other. And you hope that at the end of the day, you haven't given it conflicting commands, and it's going to give you something as close to what you asked for as you were expecting. Let me go ahead and just finish up my last couple of slides here. I already mentioned Squeeze 9 didn't actually have a reference frame control for H.264. That's a bit disconcerting. My recommendation, as I started out saying, to cut to the chase, that I think ffmpeg is the most cost-effective encoder. It will create great quality files. The only problem is you have to know how to use ffmpeg as a command line tool. There are lots of GUIs that people have tried to make for ffmpeg. And of course, always have great source files with Eddie encoder. That sort of goes without saying, the whole garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have great source, no amount of pre-processing is going to save it. I mean, commercial encoders do offer pre-processing filters. I didn't get into pre-processing filters in this at all, like whose deinterlacer is better than the other deinterlacer, because that's a big deal, right? If you have the deinterlaced footage, that's one pre-processing measure you wouldn't want to skimp on if you're still working with interlaced footage and it's not progressive. Whew, I know that was fast. I appreciate you listening to everything. I don't want to hold you from lunch. Thank you.